Hello students, I am Neeraj Kumar, Assistant Professor at National Law University, Delhi, Dwarka. We are supposed to interact with respect to a module on judicial review, which is part and parcel of a paper of judicial process. So let us just try to look into that what are the issues which crop up with respect to understanding of this subject. So we can say that that can be outline of our deliberation over a period of say half an hour or so. So the first thing in which we are interested in is what do you mean by the concept of judicial review. The second issue which becomes pertinent is what are the various factors in judicial review. Third, of course, will be what is judicial approach, because in the understanding of issues like this, it is very important to understand that how judiciary has understood those concepts, more so in countries like India, which is governed by common law legal system. And of course, since that issue is so burning and it keeps on coming to the court again and again, so that is again important to see that what are the recent trends in the judicial review understanding. So let us start. So with respect to the meaning of judicial review, all of us understand that there are three limbs of the state. The three limbs of the state of course are legislature, executive and judiciary. Traditionally, so far as the traditional understanding of the working of these three limbs of the state are considered, they are supposed to operate as if that there is some kind of compartments within which they are supposed to function and work. So of course the legislature was supposed to draft laws, enact laws, executive was supposed to implement and enforce laws, and judiciary was supposed to act like say an arbitrator, where they will say that what is the right understanding of a conflicting situation where two parties have taken a different opinion. Now why this was important? Why this was important? This was important as has been emphasized traditionally also by we can say starting from the time of Aristotle, subsequently by Lord Atkin and Montesquieu, where they have emphasized separation or separation of power between these three limbs or the organs of the state, because they always were worried that if we will allow them not to be segregated and if we will allow the power to reside in one of the entities where they will be performing all the functions, it can create a situation where they can act like say a dictator, where the democratic values, liberties of the citizens and everything else which a democratic society is interested in will get compromised. And that is why they also emphasized as a natural corollary to this that there must be check and balance amongst them. Now see, these are the things, these are the issues with respect to which all of us agree and all of the legal system agree, that is the fundamentals, that yes, there are different organs and they are supposed to work within their territory. So far as the fundamentals are considered, they have agreed upon that, and there is by and large an agreement with respect to the broader parameters. But as is the case with any legal system, that every legal system is devised, modified according to the geniuses of the society, and that is why they keep on changing it to suit their geniuses and their specific needs. So although on one side we can say that there is an agreement with respect to fundamental, but we cannot say that the agreement is an identical agreement with respect to each and every issue. And that is why so far as the modalities and the details are considered, one system varies from the other system. And we now come to this part, that how this understanding of judicial review has evolved in certain representative legal systems. So the representative legal systems which has been identified by me, and most of us will agree that by and large these are the legal system which we can look into for the purpose of understanding the concept of the judicial review. But with this caveat that we are not supposed to understand that these are the only legal system which exist. Of course there are certain variation in certain oriental legal system, of course there is an important variation in continental law legal system, but that is something which we can discuss and we can look into at different times with respect to different issues. So we have taken rather three representative system for the purposes of understanding the concept of the judicial review, how they have understood and how they have modified it according to their geniuses. So these three representative systems are England, United States, and of course our own system, that is the system which prevails in India. So let us take them one by one for the purposes of detailed understanding. So let us start with position in England. So England, as we understand, is the mother of common law countries, and that's why in England we have seen that traditionally they are governed by what we known as judge-made law. So that is also known as the understanding of common law. When we say common law, by and large, in many of the circumstances, judge-made law and the common law term are used interchangeably. Now initially, as was the understanding, that royal prerogatives, even royal prerogatives, were made subject to the common law. If we'll just for the heck of understanding this, if we can go a little bit back, we can come to a situation where king or queen was supposed to be the fountainhead of everything, and that's how the phrase rex lex, that is king is law. So he was supposed to be fountainhead of everything, that is he was legislature, he was adjudicator, and he was executor. So in that sense, royal prerogatives were basically in that context they were evolved, that for the purposes of seeking compliance to their directions, their laws, they used to issue royal prerogatives. Now subsequently, as the common law concept developed, even royal prerogatives were made subject to the common law. Now see, subsequently, because of certain agitation against the king's power, and all of us know that Magna Carta and all these things were into issue, they were debated, and subsequently over a period of time England developed what we call as parliamentary sovereignty. And perhaps English legal system is an ideal example of parliamentary sovereignty. And when we say parliamentary sovereignty, there is a saying where we say that Parliament can do everything in England. There are no boundaries and limits so far as the exercise of power by the Parliament is considered. So everything is a possibility. When we say parliamentary sovereignty prevails in England, that is Parliament is sovereign in absolute sense. So over a period of time, this concept of parliamentary sovereignty was also supposed to be curtailed. I cannot say that that was supposed to be regulated in a sense as we understand in other countries, that is countries like United States or India. It was some way little bit diluted, and to understand this, let us take a case decided by Lord Justice Coke, that is Bonham's case. In Bonham's case, which was decided ultimately in 1610, actually what has happened, that through a royal prerogative, the permission was given to the Royal College of Physicians to run courses for medicine, and not only this, they were also supposed to regulate the practice, actual practice of the profession of medicine. So any doctor which is not registered with that college was not supposed to practice. That is, firstly you get registered with that college, and then you get a permission, that is what we know as license, then only you are allowed to practice. Now since the number of the intake, as is the case with any college, will always remain limited. So what actually happened, this person by the name of Bonham, who subsequently became Dr. Bonham, he pursued his degrees of medicine from Cambridge University, and he attached himself to a society, that is Barber Surgeon Society, where they were arguing and campaigning for the purposes of allowing permission to practice, and that they must be allowed to practice even without the permission of this Royal Society. So in that sense, he was leading a movement against the original understanding that they can practice only if they get permission from the society. So he started doing all this, and subsequently a notice was served on him, and he was asked not to practice, and if a fine was also supposed to be levied on this. When this notice was served on him, he went to the college, he tried to get himself enrolled, since already the seats were full, and that's why he could not get any enrollment there, and he was asked to come again. And actually after actually next year he again tried to get himself enrolled, which for the second time again he was rejected. Now he went back to his original ways, he started practicing, and he suggested that we should be allowed to practice even if we don't have the permission from this Royal Society. And this is how the litigation actually started, because now the so-called notice was issued, and heavier penalty was supposed to be imposed. Now in between something important has happened. The parliament has actually given them the permission, that is this permission to this college, not only to regulate the practice, they were also supposed to adjudicate if a dispute arises, and they were also supposed to penalize people, and so much so that they had the power to even imprison people for the purposes of seeking a compliance. And that was which was coming directly from the parliament itself. Now this person, what he did, he actually filed a petition in the court of common cause and common pleas, where he made a case that the license and the permission for practice which is required doesn't require me to be regulated by an institution. The only thing which is required is that I must seek a consent from a patient, and if my patient gives me the consent, then I am free to practice. Now he actually got some relief from the court through the order of Lord Coke, and that is treated as famous standoff between Lord Coke and the parliament, where he suggested that even parliamentary sovereignty is also controlled by the common law, although there is a disagreement with respect to the actual interpretation, because many people think that he actually tried to look into the actual order and this and tried to suggest that the person is not answerable. But somehow this is treated as a classic case of a conflict between judiciary and parliamentary sovereignty, and people say that was the first case where parliamentary sovereignty in England was tried to be controlled, and a meeting was called between the members of that Royal College, and where Lord Chancellor also attended the meeting, and it was again decided that they must be given the permission to penalize this person. And then again in the final hearing, the court head by Lord Justice Coke suggested that no, he cannot be penalized, and that is how Dr. Bonham got the relief. But whatever were the attempts which were made, we cannot say that because of Bonham's case after 1610, the judicial review concept as evolved in England became as strong as in other representative country. The judicial review still remained a weak proposition there so far as the power against the parliamentary sovereignty is considered. Of course, without any doubt, the administrative powers were controlled. So if an administrative power is exercised, they can also be challenged as being violative of common law, being violative of other set principles of common law, being violative of laws enacted by the parliament, and through the process of judicial review, of course, the courts can control the administrative power. But so far as the control of parliamentary sovereignty by the power of judicial review is considered, that remained weak. And the most important reason for this is that they don't have a written constitution. There is some convention, and by and large that is also governed by common law doctrines. So because of absence of written constitution, the judicial review concept against the parliamentary sovereignty never became so strong in England as it actually happened in other countries. One significant development which happened in the form of Human Rights Act of 1998. Through Human Rights Act of 1998, the power comes to the court to look into the proposition that whether by a parliamentary endeavor or enactment the human rights are getting violated. But here also please understand that it is again not the same power as can be exercised in a country governed by written constitution, that they can declare any law enacted by parliament as unconstitutional or ultra vires to the Human Rights Act. Actually in this scenario, the only power which the court has got is this, that they will just identify the provisions which are violative of human rights, and they will notify it to the concerned department, and ultimately it is now for the parliament to actually rectify it, which under many of the circumstances will get rectified. But yes, unlike say India or United States, they cannot say that it is ultra vires and it is null and void. They can only pinpoint the flaw, and which has to be notified to the parliament through the concerned minister of that particular department, and now it is for the parliament to actually rectify it. So in that sense, let us come to the other system which prevails in United States, that is on the other side of the Atlantic, which is somehow drastically different from what prevails in England so far as the relationship of judiciary, executive, and judiciary and legislature is considered. and that is a possibility because of the fact that most significant difference is that American Constitution is a written constitution like British Convention of the Constitution. Since there is a written constitution, so each and every organ of the state is supposed to be governed by that written constitution, and we can say that that is a state where there is a constitutional sovereignty. We cannot say, as is the case in England, that is the situation is of parliamentary sovereignty. So and that becomes quite apparent from the clause 2 of article 6 of the US Constitution, which is also popularly known as supremacy clause, where the supremacy of the constitution and law has been specifically emphasized, that is a law which is in accordance with the constitution. So in that sense, any act of the legislature also, Congress also, if it is violative of any of the constitutional provision, that can be declared as unconstitutional. So there is some strict separation of power in the form of article 1 section 1, article 2 section 1, article 3 section 1, where they will specifically talk about the powers of the legislature, executive and judiciary, and they are supposed to operate in their domain. So by its very nature, it gives power to the judiciary to actually see that whether the executive and the Congress is working within their domain or not. If they are not working within their domain, then they can always say that it is a violation of the constitution and can declare it as unconstitutional. And the classic case which established the concept of judicial review is Marbury versus Madison, which was decided in 1803. Now this is considered as a classic case in all legal system which is governed by a written constitution. That is, this is a case which gave birth to what we call as the concept of judicial review as understood in most of the countries governed by the written constitution. Now what has actually happened in Marbury versus Madison? As we understand that in United States, the president is supposed to appoint the judges. Now President Adams appointed Mr. Marbury as one of the judges. Now actually what happened after that, he never got any letter from the Secretary of the State confirming his appointment, and that is why he filed a petition in the court where he asked that Mr. Madison, who happened to be the Secretary of the State at that point of time, must be through a judicial order, must be asked to issue the letter for his appointment. Now for understanding this case, we must understand it from two perspectives. One, that whether it recognized the power of the court to look into the action of authorities, other authorities. Without any doubt, Marbury versus Madison does so, that it can look into the power exercised by the other organs of the state for the purposes of deciding that whether that is in consonance with constitution or not. Now with respect to that clearly has been established by as an outcome of Marbury versus Madison. With respect to the second part, that is whether the relief was given or not, on technical understanding the relief was not given. But we are more concerned in the first premise, that is it recognized the power of the judicial review, and of course this is supposed to be exercised by the courts of the country, and by and large the power of the judicial review, as we understand in classic sense, is exercised by the superior courts. Sometimes they are also called as constitutional courts. And once this power was exercised, they started looking into many issues. And another classic case was Brown versus Board of Education, where they actually set aside a provision which segregated white people from black people and suggested that is violative of equality principle under the US Constitution. And this is how the court started looking into many actions of the other organs of the state. And in today's context, many people say that it is a double-edged sword. That is, without any doubt, this power is important for the purposes of understanding of the constitution, and of course there has to be an entity, and judiciary is the best place entity, best possible entity for the purposes of interpretation of the constitution. But many times while exercising this power, they transgress their limit, and while transgressing their limit, people say that sometimes they go against the popular opinion, and when we say that they go against the popular opinion, they actually are treated as non-democratic institution, and this is a debate which prevails in many countries. And so far as the Indian situation on this is considered, we will come to it at subsequent stage. So far as the position in India is considered, without any doubt, India adopted a written constitution in 1950. So it's quite logical that we can talk about the understanding of concept of judicial review only after coming into force of Indian constitution, that is 1950 onward. Now if we'll see that Indian constitution, unlike US constitution, clearly is not talking about separation of power, but through various processes, various judicial interpretation, court has rightly come to this conclusion that maybe we can say that there is no absolute separation of power as prevails in United States, but we cannot say that there is no separation of power at all. By and large, constitution has set the broad parameters for the purposes of coming to the conclusion where we can say that it is a constitution which recognizes a limited state, that is a state which is governed by the constitution and not by the power to be exercised by any organ of the state. So in other words, it means that power exercised by any organ of the state is a legitimate power only when it is in consonance with the provisions of the constitution. Now if we will see Indian constitution basically recognizes the concept of judicial review through explicit provisions, and it also recognizes as an inherent basic proposition of the constitution. So explicit provisions like Article 13, which says that any law enacted by the parliament or any law, and the meaning of the law is quite wider under Article 13, it includes everything. So under those circumstances, if it is violative of fundamental rights, they have to be declared as unconstitutional. And of course this power is a power of the judicial review, that is through judicial process only the enactment or an act can be declared as unconstitutional. Say when we say explicitly, we can also say that Article 246 is there, which says that these are the subject matters over which the state, union, they are supposed to exercise their power, and if they transgress their power, then of course again the court will decide that whether they have transgressed the power or not, and if they come to this conclusion that the power has been transgressed, they will of course declare it as unconstitutional. But as suggested when we started with this provision, that it is not only explicit, it is inherent in the Indian constitution, and it can be treated as a common string which runs through the constitution of India. Now see, when we talk about the concept of judicial review under Indian constitution, as is the understanding of judicial review under Indian constitution, we can say that there are three dimensions to this. One of course is to ensure fairness in the administrative action, and the principles on which administrative action are always judged are whether they are violative of any legislative enactment, whether they are violative of constitutional provision. They can also be checked on the basis that whether they have followed the other principles to govern administrative action, such as principles of natural justice, so on and so forth. The second dimension can be that through the power of the judicial review, constitution tries to protect fundamental right and other rights. So fundamental rights, we understand that is there under part 3, and if there is a violation of fundamental right, Article 32 and 226 of the constitution can be invoked. 32 the power is with Supreme Court, Article 226 the power is with the high courts. Now there is a possibility of claiming violation of other rights also. Of course with respect to other rights, under most of the circumstances an individual has no direct access to the Supreme Court, but he can of course invoke the power of the high courts under Article 226, and he can come through an appellate process to the Supreme Court to get an adjudication on that. There is another dimension to this concept of judicial review, that India being a federal country by and large, now we are not at this point of time into this issue that whether it is a classical federalism or some compromise has been made with respect to classical federalism as understood in United States. We are trying to understand this concept in a limited sense here, that is there is some distribution of power between center and state. Now when there is a distribution of power between center and state, so of course there is always a possibility that they can transgress their powers. This can happen either in an explicit manner, an implicit manner, and when we talk about the power to be exercised by the legislature, we give them benefit of doubt that they don't intend to do it explicitly. It only means that they must have forgotten that there are limitations, and this is how court approaches them. They don't impute any malafide on the part of center or states legislatures for the purposes of saying that they have transgressed their limit. But of course there is a possibility of coming directly to Supreme Court under the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, where they can agitate that either center or the state has violated the norm set by the constitution, and it can be with respect to territorial jurisdiction, it can be with respect to subject matter jurisdiction. So, it can be under Article 245, it can be under Article 246, and the consequences has been provided in Article 247 till Article 254 that what are the circumstances under which we are supposed to understand this. But if the court comes to this conclusion by exercise of their power, that is the power of the judicial review, they can always strike it down. Now, as a matter of fact, we must also understood that when we are again and again talking about the concept of the judicial review, the concept of the judicial review basically encompasses three different possibilities. One is we say that there is a possibility of judicial review of administrative action. Second, we say that there is a possibility of judicial review of legislative action. Third, we say that there is a possibility of judicial review of judicial action also. So, when we talk about judicial review of the judicial action, by and large we treat it as a supervisory power of a superior court over an inferior court, and that is why in popular parlance, by and large when we talk about the concept of the judicial review, we confine ourselves to the first two things, that is the judicial review of administrative action and judicial review of the legislative action. But that is not to take away the basic understanding that there is a possibility of judicial review of judicial actions also. Now, what are the tools which are employed by the courts for the purposes of exercising their power of the judicial review? So, the first and the most important power is the power under writ jurisdiction, and of course that these powers are under Article 32 and 226. Article 32 is supposed to be exercised by Supreme Court and 226 to be by the High Court, that is quite obvious. Now, these writs are as similar to prerogative writs which has developed in England, is being followed in US also, that is 5 named writ, that is writ of habeas corpus, mandamus, quo warranto, prohibition and certiorari. Now, so far as we will see the Indian Constitution under Article 32 and 226, it does not say that these are the only writs, and in a specific classical understanding these writs are supposed to be issued. The Constitution says that these are the name writs, and they say that writs in the nature of these writs can be issued. So, of course, the court has the power to modify the classical understanding of these writs theoretically under the Constitution, but by and large we will see the actual working of the court, they have followed the traditional and the classical understanding of these writs. So, just a brief understanding of these writs. Writ of habeas corpus is generally issued against executive, and the meaning and the literal meaning of this writ of habeas corpus is, that is they are asked to produce the body of a person who is claimed to be missing and whose wherewithal is not known. If the court issues this writ, the person who is supposed to be in the custody of that individual is, or the entity who is supposed to be custody of that individual is supposed to bring the knowledge of wherewithals to the court. Second is writ of mandamus, that is again issued against the executive, where we say that when the executive is legally bound to do certain things and they are not doing that, in spite of repeated requests made by the aggrieved party, the court can ask them to follow their legal mandate and fulfill their legal obligation. Writ of quo warranto is a writ which is issued in a case where a party comes to the court claiming that an individual is unconstitutionally holding an office. So, in that scenario, if a writ of quo warranto is issued, then we say that the person loses the right to continue in that office, he has to demit the office, and the classical case of this was the case of Jayalalitha, where the court suggested that she is not entitled to continue as a chief minister because she is ineligible to be the legislature, and that is why she must demit the office, which of course she demitted. Now, the fourth writ is writ of prohibition. Now, writ of prohibition and fifth writ, that is the writ of certiorari, these are the two writs which are many times invoked in one litigation itself. That is, these are the writs which can be issued against quasi-judicial authorities, where through writ of prohibition they are asked not to proceed with the matter with which they are seized. It means that superior courts have come to this conclusion that they are transgressing their mandate under the Constitution and they do not have any jurisdiction over that matter, and that is why they are prohibited to pursue it further. When the writ of certiorari is issued, the court comes to this conclusion that they have done something beyond their jurisdiction, and by issuing the writ of certiorari, the court says that whatever you have done has no legal sanctity, it is unconstitutional, and that stands null and void. That is the impact of all these writs. Now, let us see certain landmark cases in India for the purposes of understanding all this process of development of judicial review. So, the first case came almost in the first year of the working of Indian constitution itself, that is A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras, where Supreme Court gave a very narrow interpretation of the rights of the individual, and they suggested that Indian constitution under Article 21 only allows for procedure established by the law. So, if there is something which has been established by that law, and if that process has been followed, then the courts are not supposed to say it that they must be doing it in some different manner. So, in that case a very narrow interpretation was given, and because of which many people say that A.K. Gopalan case in a way gave a very larger area of operation to the legislature, and it only allowed the control of the executive power. Then through a various process of development, that is Satwan Singh case and Khadak Singh case, ultimately the court came to Menka Gandhi case in 1978, where through the process of interpretation they suggested that this procedure established by law is as good as a due process under the US constitution, that is both substantive and procedural due process. And this they did by combined reading of the various provisions of the constitution, and through this the courts were given a wider power over the legislative enactments also. And after this there has been a continued expansion of Article 21 under judicial review. Now, in that sense one more doctrine becomes quite relevant, that is what is known as basic structure doctrine under Indian constitution, which was developed in Keswanand Bharti case in 1973, and of course there were precursor in the form of Sankari Prasad, Sajjan Singh, Golaknath. Now, Keswanand Bharti did something which was extraordinary. It suggested that forget about the ordinary legislative power to be exercised by the parliament, even the extraordinary power, that is the power to amend the constitution, which is considered as a plenary power, to which the Supreme Court agreed in Keswanand Bharti that it is not an ordinary power, it is a plenary power of the parliament. Even then they are governed by something called what Supreme Court pronounced as basic structure doctrine. So the court suggested that yes, by exercising your power under Article 368 to amend the constitution, you can do many more things which you cannot do while exercising your legislative power, but still you cannot take away the basic structure. So, because of this basic structure doctrine, the power of judicial review became quite deep in India, and many people say that because of basic structure doctrine, the Indian Supreme Court is more powerful than the court of United States also. Now, one more thing which comes in debate nowadays is that whether Indian judiciary follows strict scrutiny doctrine, and some indication to that effect was given in Anuj Garg's case. But there is divergence of opinion, and many people say that this issue is still res integra, that is no final settlement has actually happened. Strict scrutiny is basically a scrutiny where if equality principles are being violated, some liberties are being violated, it gives the court the deeper scrutiny power, which is generally followed in United States. But as I suggested just now, that Indian Supreme Court has not confirmed it with certainty, there has been enough of vacillation, and that is why we are still to come to a final conclusion that what will happen subsequently. As a matter of fact, at the end we must also know that the power of judicial review, as we started with, that under Indian constitution all three organs are controlled by the constitution. So, the power of the judicial review exercised by judiciary is also controlled by constitution, and that is why it means that this power is not absolute, it is a limited power. It can be implied limitation, it can be express limitation. Express limitation example is 9th schedule, that is if the power if certain enactment is being put in the 9th schedule to the constitution, then it cannot be reviewed by a court. Of course, that was originally supposed to take care of only land reform laws, and that is why subsequent including of other laws in 9th schedule created certain issues which were finally settled by Ayer Kolo's case. And in 2007 court suggested that any law, that is the prerogative of the parliament to put any law in 9th schedule, There is no such understanding that it can be only land reform laws, but yes, any law when being put in 9th schedule because of Kesavananda Bharati case after 4th April 1973 when Kesavananda judgment was delivered, all laws put in 9th schedule is also subjected to the judicial review on the parameters of basic structure doctrine. Implied limitation are policy decision, such as Balco's case where Supreme Court suggested that yes, so far as the economic policies are considered, that is the absolute prerogative of the executive, we cannot look into that. And as a matter of the fact, we can say that in conclusion that all democratic societies by and large has accepted this doctrine, that is the doctrine of judicial review, as an integral part. There are certain recent controversies which has arisen in India, for example in 2G case where 2 judges suggested that we can also look into policy issues, which was disagreed upon by the Supreme Court in Presidential Reference number 1 of 2012, where they suggested that no policy decision we cannot look into. In that sense, we can say that although this concept is established and deeply embedded in our constitution, but this content is an ever evolving content, and we are still to see that ultimately how it will unfold in future. Something can be added and something can be deleted to the detailed understanding of this concept. Thank you very much. With this I finish the interaction with respect to this module, and of course as a matter of fact that is not the all aspect. I have tried to deal with the most significant one within the limited space which we have got. Thank you again.